Okay, picture this. You're standing in the Saudi Arabian desert today. It's incredibly hot, dry, and now trying to imagine massive ice sheets covering that exact spot.
It sounds completely counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Totally wild.
Uh,
But the rocks right under your feet, they actually tell that story. And understanding these ancient glaciogenic deposits, rocks formed by glaciers, it isn't just a history lesson.
no, not at all. As we'll definitely get into, it turns out to be really relevant for, well, for finding energy resources right now.
It's a perfect example, really, of how looking deep, deep into the past helps us in the present.
Yeah, those ancient ice ages left behind very specific rock types. And those rocks are now, critical targets for exploration.
And that's exactly what this deep dive is all about today. We're plunging into the Upper Ordovician Glaciogenic deposits, the UOGD of Saudi Arabia.
Right.
We've been digging through a whole stack of research summaries focusing just on these rocks. They detail studies looking at, well, everything from the big picture, the environments they formed in millions of years ago.
Right down to the tiny, tiny details, like the pore spaces within the rock, and even some pretty strange iron deposits they found.
Yeah, these sources cover, the rock characteristics, their potential to actually hold gas, how geologists identify them when they're buried deep underground.
And clues about where the sand and mud originally came from, the provenance, and, crucially, what happened to the rock after it was deposited over millions of years.
So our mission today is basically to unpack all these findings for you. We want to pull out the most important insights from these, frankly, quite detailed geological studies.
Help you understand what makes these rocks special, why they matter, especially as potential tight gas sandstone reservoirs.
And maybe touch on some surprising connections along the way. Okay, let's dive in.
Sounds good. So maybe let's set the scene first.
Okay.
What exactly are these UOGD in Saudi Arabia?
Right, the basics. They're sedimentary rock formations. They were deposited way back during the late Ordovician period.
Which was a time of major glaciation globally. Even places like Arabia, which seems hard to believe now.
And in Saudi Arabia specifically, geologists give them different names depending on where they find them outcropping at the surface. You've got the Zarqa, Sara, and Haban formations. That's in the central, north, and northwest areas.
And then the Sanama Formation down in the southwest.
But the research we looked at makes it pretty clear that when you're talking about the subsurface, where drilling happens, they mostly just call it the Sara Formation. It's like an umbrella term.
Yeah, that simplifies things. And they've studied it using core samples, actual rock cylinders pulled up from deep wells in places like the Rub al-Khali Basin.
That huge desert in the south.
That's the one.
Yeah.
But also from outcrops, places where these same ancient layers are actually exposed at the surface in other parts of the country.
And you mentioned their significance right away, beyond just being old rocks. That's key, isn't it?
Absolutely. Their importance lies in the fact that they contain significant hydrocarbon reservoirs.
Hydrocarbons, meaning oil or gas.
In this case, the studies really highlight them as potential tight gas sandstone reservoirs.
Okay, tight gas. What does that mean exactly?
It means they hold natural gas, yes, but the rock itself is tight. The pore spaces are small, and the pathways connecting them, the permeability, is low.
So the gas is trapped.
Pretty much. Getting it out isn't straightforward. It often requires techniques like hydraulic fracturing to create pathways for the gas to flow.
Okay, that makes sense. So understanding the rock is critical, which brings us to how geologists actually read this ancient landscape. How do they figure out what environments existed millions of years ago just by looking at rocks?
That's where the concept of facies comes in. It's fundamental to geology.
Facies?
Think of facies as, well, the sum total of characteristics of a rock unit that tells you about the conditions under which it formed. Different rock types, or even different textures within the same rock type, they point to different depositional environments.
Like a river deposit looks different from sediment settled at the bottom of a quiet lake.
Exactly. And in this specific case, the Glaciogenic Sara Formation, the studies identified 4 main groups of facies. They call them facies associations, each one representing a distinct environment shaped by those ancient glaciers.
4 main types. What are they?
Okay, so first you have rocks indicating fluvial environments. These are basically ancient river deposits. Then there are glaciofluvial deposits.
Glaciofluvial, so glacier river.
Yeah, meltwater streams flowing off or away from the melting ice. Then you get glacial-constrained delta deposits. Think of a lake formed by or fed by glacial meltwater, and a river dumping sediment into it, building out a delta.
Okay, rivers, meltwater streams. glacial lakes. What's the last one?
The last one is subglacial deposits. This is material that was basically deposited directly underneath the moving ice sheet itself, often messy, jumbled stuff.
Wow, so quite a range of environments all linked to the ice, from, fast-flowing rivers to quiet lakes, and then right under the glacier. How do they tell these apart, especially from just, say, rock chips or data from a deep well?
Well, they integrate a few key techniques that the sources detail. Analyzing cores is crucial, those actual rock samples.
Seeing the rock itself.
Yes. Then there's petrography, looking at really thin slices of the rock under a microscope to see the grains, the cements, the textures.
Microscopic details.
And they also rely heavily on geophysical logs run down the wellbore. Things like spectral gamma ray or SGR, which measures the natural radioactivity in the rock layers. Different minerals and clays have different signatures.
And the studies mentioned combining these methods is really powerful, like the core descriptions and the SGR logs.
Absolutely. Integrating the visual analysis from cores, when you have them, with the continuous SGR data helps them distinguish between different types of sandstones or those diamectites you mentioned.
Those messy glacial deposits.
Right. They can differentiate them even in intervals where they don't have a physical core sample. That integration provides guidelines for identifying these ancient environments just from the log data, which is essential for mapping them out in the subsurface.
Okay, so now we have a picture of what these rocks are and where they came from in terms of the ancient glacial landscape. But you mentioned tight gas. So the real crunch comes down to reservoir quality, right?
Exactly. This is where the geological story directly impacts the energy potential. Reservoir quality is basically, it's two main things.
Porosity and permeability.
You got it. Porosity is the storage space. How much empty volume is in the rock to hold gas or fluids?
Yeah.
And permeability is about flow. How easily can those fluids move through the rock? How connected are those pore spaces?
And I guess in these glacial rocks, it's not all created equal.
Far from it. The studies really emphasize that the quality varies a lot, and it's controlled mainly by two factors. First, the original depositional phases we just talked about.
Because where it was deposited, river, lake, under ice determined the starting material. Grain size, sorting, that kind of thing?
Precisely. But that's only half the story. The second major factor is diagenetic processes.
Diagenesis, those are the changes after burial, right?
Yes, everything that happens to the sediment after it's deposited and as it becomes rock. The studies look closely at things like compaction, the weight of overlying sediments, squeezing the grains together, reducing pore space.
Makes sense.
Cementation, where new minerals precipitate out of fluids flowing through the rock, basically gluing grains together and potentially blocking pores. And sometimes dissolution, where certain minerals dissolve, which can actually create new pore space or enhance existing connections.
So the ancient environment sets the stage, but then later chemistry and pressure can really change the game for storing and flowing gas.
That's a great way to put it. And the key finding, consistently across the studies, is that the reservoir quality is strongly linked to the facies. The best quality, highest porosity, and permeability tends to be found in those fluvial sandstones, the ancient river deposits.
Okay, river's good. What about the worst?
Generally, the poorest quality is in what they call matrix-supported diamectites, those messy, poorly sorted glacial deposits with lots of fine-grade material clay and silt clogging up the potential pore spaces.
Right. The studies also mentioned something about dual porosity in the fluvial sandstones. What's that about? Does it mean two kinds of pores?
That's the idea. It suggests there might be a combination of pore types contributing to storage and flow, maybe larger spaces between the main sand grains, but also networks of smaller pores, perhaps within clay aggregates or due to some dissolution. It points to a more complex pore system, even in the better quality rocks.
And figuring all this out involved looking at everything together.
Yes, the conclusions come from integrating all the available data. The descriptions of the core samples, the microscopic studies like petrography, using QIM-scan for detailed mineralogy.
ChemScan, what's that?
It's a type of automated microscopy, quantitative evaluation of minerals by scanning electron microscopy.
Yeah.
It basically maps out exactly what minerals are present and where on a very fine scale.
Ah, okay. A mineral map.
Yeah. And of course, direct lab measurements on core plugs, testing their actual porosity and permeability. Got it. Okay, let's zoom in even further then. We've talked environments, overall quality. But for tight gas, the devil is often in the microscopic details, isn't it? The tiny pore spaces themselves. The studies really went to town here with techniques.
They really did deploy a whole arsenal, a comprehensive suite of tools to probe the pore system. Think of it like using different kinds of lenses and scanners to see the pores from multiple angles.
So beyond this standard core analysis for bulk, porosity, and permeability.
Right. Beyond that, they use petrography again and scanning electron microscopy SEM for high-resolution images of pore shapes and the minerals lining them. They use that QMESCAN mineral mapping we just mentioned.
Okay. What else?
They use microcomputed tomography, CT, that's like a medical CT scan, but for rocks. It lets them build 3D digital models of the pore network inside the sample.
Wow, you can actually see the plumbing in 3D.
Pretty much. And nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR. In rocks, NMR probes the fluids in the pores and gives information about the size distribution of those pores. Are they big macropores or tiny micropores? Okay, NMR for pore size. Anything else?
And finally, electrical resistivity measurements on the core samples. This helps link the rock's properties, its minerals, its porosity, the fluids inside, to how it conducts electricity.
Which is crucial because electrical resistivity is one of the main things measured by logging tools down a well, right? To find oil and gas.
Exactly. So measuring it in the lab on known samples helps calibrate and understand the log measurements from the subsurface.
That is a lot of different techniques, which raises the question, why use so many methods to look at essentially the same thing, the pores?
Because each one tells you something different, a complementary piece of the puzzle. Standard core analysis gives you an average number, like overall porosity.
Yeah.
But it doesn't tell you why it's that number.
Right, it doesn't show you the pore structure.
Exactly. Visual methods like SEM and petrography show you the geometry, what the pores look like, what minerals are there. QMSCAN gives you the precise mineral quantities. CT shows you the 3D connectivity. NMR focuses on the pore sizes and fluids. And resistivity links it all back to the well logs.
So putting them all together gives a much richer, more reliable picture than any single method alone.
Precisely. You need that integration to really understand a complex, tight gas sandstone.
Okay, so using this whole toolkit, what were some of the key findings about the pore systems in these Ordovician rocks?
Well, one thing they could do was define hydraulic flow units, or HFUs. Based on plotting porosity versus permeability, they could group parts of the rock that behave similarly when it comes to fluid flow. It helps simplify the complexity a bit.
Grouping rocks with similar flow behavior? Makes sense.
They also pinpointed the main culprits causing reservoir heterogeneity, the variability at this tiny scale. Things like the type and distribution of clay minerals clogging pores, the presence of tiny microfractures which can sometimes help flow, and the effects of those diagetic processes dissolution, creating pores, cements blocking them.
And they compared porosity measurements from different methods too, like helium injection versus NMR versus just weighing.
Yes, they did. And they noted where the results agreed and where they differed, which often relates back to the specific rock type, the complexity of the pore system, especially the presence of tiny micropores that some methods measure differently than others.
Interesting. What about the NMR specifically?
The NMR T2 profiles were particularly useful for understanding that pore size distribution differentiated the contribution of larger effective pores versus the very small micropores. They could even estimate permeability from the NMR data and found it generally correlated well with the direct helium permeability measurements, which builds confidence.
And the electrical measurements?
They related the resistivity to porosity and the different rock types, and importantly, they could determine a key parameter called the cementation factor, or M. You need that M value to accurately calculate water saturation, how much gas versus water is in the rock from the resistivity logs run in the well.
So it all ties together. These microscopic details, pore size, connections, the minerals lining the pores, they directly control the bigger picture reservoir performance and how we actually assess these rocks remotely using well logs.
Absolutely. The microscale governs the macroscale behavior.
Okay, we've looked inside the pores. What about the rock's history, its journey? The studies also used geochemistry, right? The chemistry of the rocks themselves.
Yes, geochemistry acts like a fingerprint, offering clues about the rock's origins and history. One key aspect is provenance, figuring out where the original sediment came from.
And what did they find?
The studies suggest the sand and mud were mostly derived from the weathering of ancient continental rocks, specifically the felsic rocks, think granite-like, of the Arabian Shield.
The Arabian Shield. That's the really old, stable core of the Arabian Peninsula.
Exactly. That ancient landmass was the source. The geochemistry also gave clues about the tectonic setting back then.
Tectonic setting, like mountain building.
Yep. The interpretation is that deposition occurred on a passive margin. So not an active plate boundary with mountains rising, but a relatively stable continental edge.
Okay, stable setting, material coming off the old shield. Did geochemistry tell them anything else?
Yeah, they also looked at indicators of chemical weathering, how much the minerals were altered before or during transport, and how that relates to the different depositional environments, and importantly, how that geochemical maturity links back, again, to the ultimate reservoir quality.
It all keeps connecting back to reservoir quality.
Because that's the main driver for studying these rocks in such detail.
Right. Now, you mentioned something earlier that sounded really intriguing. Strange iron deposits. Tell me about the curious case of iron.
Ah, yes, the ferruginous deposits. These are quite distinct features described in the studies, particularly from outcrops of the Sahara Formation in central Saudi Arabia. They take various forms like spherical concretions, tube-like pipes, and distinct layers, all rich in iron.
Iron rich.
Oh,
Like rusty.
essentially, yes. Mineral analysis showed they're composed mainly of goethite. That's an iron oxyhydroxide mineral, a common component of rust.
And where did all that iron come from? Back to the shield again.
That seems to be the most likely source, yeah. Weathering of iron-bearing minerals in the Arabian shield rocks, transported by water and then precipitated within these sediments.
Okay, so iron concretions, but you said there was something really interesting about them.
Yes. This is where it gets cool. The researchers compared these features found in what they interpret as ancient glaciofluvial settings. Remember those meltwater stream deposits? They compare them to similar iron-rich concretions and structures found in completely different environments on Earth, like modern river systems or wind-blown sand dunes,
Okay.
and into features observed on the surface of Mars.
Wait, on Mars? Seriously, how does that work? What's the connection?
Well, Mars rovers, like Curiosity and Perseverance, have found lots of evidence of past water activity, and they've also found features like spherical concretions, sometimes called blueberries, that are rich in iron minerals like hematite.
Hematite, related to goethite.
Yes, another iron oxide. So the thinking is that studying how these goethite concretions formed here on Earth, in a specific environment involving water flow and iron chemistry in this case, glacial meltwater might provide clues or an analog for understanding how similar-looking features might have formed on Mars billions of years ago when it likely had liquid water.
Wow. So these ancient Saudi Arabian rocks could be helping us understand the geological history of another planet.
Potentially, yes. It highlights how studying geological processes on Earth, even ancient ones, can have implications for planetary science. It's a fascinating bit of comparative planetology tucked away in these studies.
That is really cool. And this whole iron story actually connects back to a very practical challenge when trying to evaluate these rocks for gas, doesn't it? Something called low resistivity pay.
It absolutely does. LRP, low resistivity pay zones. These are intervals in a well that look wet on standard electrical resistivity logs.
Meaning the logs suggest they're full of conductive salt water rather than resistive hydrocarbons like gas.
Exactly. The resistivity reading is lower than you'd expect for a gas-bearing zone. But when tested, these zones sometimes actually produce hydrocarbons. They're pay zones, despite the low resistivity. So the question is, why?
And the studies looked into this for these Ordovician sandstones. What did they find?
They found that the culprits are often specific minerals present in the rock, particularly those acting as cements between the main sand grains, which are usually non-conductive quartz and feldspar.
Okay, which minerals?
Two main types highlighted were iron oxides, like the goethite we just discussed, and hematite, and also kaolinite, which is a type of clay mineral.
How do they cause the low resistivity?
Well, two ways. First, the iron oxides themselves can sometimes be electrically conductive, providing pathways for electrical current that lower the overall rock resistivity.
Okay, conductive minerals. What about the kaolinite? That's a clay, usually not conductive itself.
Right, but kaolinite often forms as microscopic crystals within the pore spaces. This creates a network of very, very tiny pores, micropores. These micropores tend to hold on to water due to capillary forces, even when the larger pores are filled with gas.
So even if there's gas in the main highway pores, there's still water held in these tiny side street micropores created by the kaolinite.
Exactly. And because that water is usually salty and conductive, the presence of this irreducible water bound within the microporous kaolinite can create a conductive network throughout the rock, significantly lowering its bulk resistivity reading on the logs.
Making it look wet even when there's gas. So you've got conductive iron minerals and water trapped in microporous clays, both contributing to these tricky LRP zones.
Precisely. It means that assessing the true hydrocarbon saturation using just the standard resistivity logs can be really challenging in these rocks. You absolutely need to integrate that detailed mineralogical information from things like ChemScan and understand the pore structure from SEM or NMR to correctly evaluate these zones.
Wow. Okay, so we have really gone on quite a journey here, haven't we? Starting with imagining those ancient ice sheets over Saudi Arabia,
Yeah, quite a mental image.
then tracing the different environments left behind the rivers, the glacial lakes, the stuff under the ice, seeing how those environments basically set the stage for whether the rock could eventually hold gas.
Its initial reservoir potential.
And tearing right down into the microscopic plumbing with that whole suite of fancy tools.
The CT, NMR, QM scan, all of that.
Deciphering the rock's depper history and origin using its chemistry. And then this fascinating detour into iron concretions, Mars analogies, and the practical problem of low resistivity pay zones.
It really covers the whole spectrum, from the basin scale down to the pore scale, and links geology to petrophysics and even planetary science.
It absolutely highlights how many different layers of investigation you need to really get a handle on a complex rock unit like this, especially when it's a target for resources.
Definitely. We've seen that understanding these Ordovician deposits really requires integrating all the evidence. You need the big picture sedimentology, mapping out those ancient facies.
You need the pore scale details from all those analytical techniques.
You need the geochemical story of its origin and alteration.
And you even need to understand the impact of specific minerals, like the iron oxides and kaolinite, on how we actually evaluate the rocks using well logs.
It's a multidisciplinary effort.
It really is. And it's just a powerful reminder, I think, that even rocks that might look like simple sandstone on the surface hold these incredibly complex histories. You know, shaped by ancient glaciers, changed by chemical processes over millions of years.
And maybe even reflecting processes that happen on other planets. These studies showcase the sheer amount of detective work involved in understanding just one formation in one part of the world.
A story written in stone, like you said, just waiting for us to figure out how to read it. So thinking about all this, how does uncovering these incredibly deep historical and microscopic details actually influence how we approach finding and producing energy today? And maybe even more broadly, what other secrets might these incredibly old rocks still hold for us? Perhaps clues about past climates, or, as you hinted, maybe even about conditions on worlds we haven't even explored yet.